Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual training focused on assessing and responding to anonymized threats in the K-12 school safety environment. On behalf of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, CISA, welcome. This is the latest in our virtual training series for the K-12 community. My name is Don Huff and I'm a member of the CISA School Safety Task Force. Today, I'll be serving as your moderator. I want to start by saying thank you for taking time out of your and for your shared commitment to creating the safest learning environments for young people. The CISA School Safety Task Force has a singular purpose of strengthening and enhancing the safety and security of K-12 schools across our country. Our team does this through a range of ways, some of which include coordinating federal efforts on school safety, educating K-12 communities to help raise awareness of security threats and of the related resources and capacity building tools that are available to schools and districts to prevent violence, but certainly mitigate the impacts of that in an emergency event. Our virtual training series is designed to tackle topics of critical importance to school leaders such as yourself. We strive to lift up voices from the K-12 community to really get into the discussion of the scope of these challenges, what strategies are available to address them, lessons learned from colleagues, and sharing of resources and tools that you can put your hands on tomorrow, today, next month to improve the safety of your school community. Today, I'm so pleased to be joined by two incredible leaders in the K-12 community. Dr. Kathy Gombos is the principal of Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut since 2013. She's also an active member of the Principals Recovery Network, or PRN. The PRN is made up of current and former school leaders who have experienced gun violence tragedies in their school buildings. Together, the PRN seeks to assist principals in the immediate aftermath of crisis, sharing their collective wisdom and assisting schools during recovery. Today we also have Brian LeBlanc, a supervisory special agent with the Boston Division of the FBI. He's a member of the Joint Terrorism Task Force and specializes in complex counterterrorism investigation. Brian has been a leading national force investigating K-12 swatting, hoax, and anonymized threats. Through this, Brian and his colleagues have trained thousands of school administrators, teachers, and community members on today's exact topic. It's not lost on me that anonymized threats of violence directed at schools are taxing both our school administrators and our law enforcement resources. The net effect of this has contributed to loss of instructional time and certainly has had traumatizing effects on school communities. Recently, a survey of over 950 K-12 school teachers from across the United States, over 1/3, 35%, reported that their school had been disrupted by a threat posted on social media during the previous school year. Social media-based threats and other type of anonymized threats, hoax calls for example, are just becoming increasingly common. This age of internet and technology grant a perception of anonymity that can make individuals more comfortable saying or doing things online that they just would never do in person. Today's discussion, we're going to focus on better understanding these type of threats, how they're impacting schools like yours, and steps we can take to deter them, and sound response strategies that balance both the risk of the threat with the educational mission of our schools. Before we get to that, a couple housekeeping items I'd be remiss as your moderator not to highlight. First, all participant microphones are disabled to avoid any unexpected background noise and ensure you can hear our panelists. You'll see on the right side of your screen, you'll find a question and answer panel. Throughout today's session, you're welcome to submit questions using this feature. We've actually reserved some time later in today's sessions where we'll be taking and posing your questions to our panelists. Also keep an eye out for alert messages with links to resources, additional information, a link to live captioning for today's event, and technical guidance that will help support your experience. Finally, you can check in for today's session with the poll that's in the Q&A panel. This will do two things for us. One, it'll help us get a sense of who's here today, but also for those of you that are seeking a participation certificate for today's event, please be sure to complete this poll and the poll at the end of the training. Okay, now that we've got through some of the upfront items, let's get started. Kathy, Brian, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
We know that anonymized threats against schools can be incredibly disruptive to the learning environment. In addition to the significant loss of instructional time and the impact on school leaders, school students, community members is significant. Let's get started by taking a look at a few examples of the anonymized threats over this past year.
Virginia School District is closed today because of threats made on social media. Russell County Public Schools announced this morning that schools would not be open after administrators were informed of potential threats targeting schools in the district.
Right now, multiple school districts in our region are on high alert after threats of potential violence on social media.
We keep hearing about it, and at least one school district in Virginia closed school yesterday, and another has upped security to protect students and staff.
Woodland Hills High School students dismissed just moments ago as the district responds to an anonymous social media threat. Police are now sweeping that building, and evening activities at the school have all been canceled. Meanwhile, police have increased patrols at the elementary buildings and middle school.
We begin this afternoon with a shooting threat posted on social media platform Reddit. We thank you for joining us here at 4. I'm Ariel Yacobanzi. Now, this is what caused that panic. It targets Churchill High School in Eugene, terrifying both parents and their children who saw it on their social media feeds.
Wow, that's just a small segment of the news reports that we've all become too familiar with. Kathy and Brian, I want to hear your expertise. Can you share some examples of what these anonymized threats have looked like in your experience in your school communities and the impacts that they're having? Are there trends? Are there elements of them that we should really be aware of? Brian?
Thank you, John. So this idea, this concept of these anonymized threats has been really happening across the country and across the world for that matter. This has been a global issue that has been, law enforcement and teen school and education departments have been dealing with a lot over the last several years, and it's continued to increase. The FBI, we estimate there's over thousands of swatting incidents every year, 5,000 to 7,000 bomb threats every year. And the vast majority of those are committed by juveniles. They're usually 12 to 17 years old, part of an online social network. They're online gamers, and they're simply doing this to cause chaos. In fact, in the end, there is no physical threat to the targeted location, is what we find, that they're simply trying to achieve the goal of causing chaos, is what it comes down to. And really, the only danger is to the first responders and the innocent victims that are attending that school when you are immediately going to panic mode of evacuating, and then you have a massive law enforcement response. And so some of those characteristics that can be used to quickly identify these as hoaxes, and then you can have a much more measured response and a safer response for everybody that's involved.
Yeah.
Our school community, like many of those all over the country, and Sandy Hook obviously could be more of a target because of the name or such, but even just in Connecticut in general, we've seen a increase recently of hotlines. So I feel like kids are finding different ways to do it. It used to be, from our experience, what we experienced in the 10 years ago, were gamers online, daring each other. And then watching the response actually on their TV. I don't know that they get that response anymore, but there certainly is a theme that it is coming in from other resources now. They're calling hotlines, they're using suicide hotlines, and they're using all kinds of numbers that they think are not traceable, but thanks to the efforts of the FBI, I think we've gotten so much better at figuring out where they're coming from. And like Brian said, there are characteristics that you can pick up on immediately. I think the issue becomes whether you believe they're false or not, it doesn't matter. As a K-12 educator, you have to take it completely serious no matter how it sounds to you. And so there are things that we all need to do to keep them from happening and also to mitigate our response so it's appropriate.
Yeah.
If I can just add to that, like, the techniques that they're using, we're definitely seeing those trends of they're using obviously phone calls, and they're using VoIP numbers, the voice over internet protocol numbers, and VPNs and other anonymizers to hide their true IP address and be able to stay anonymous. They're using email services. Like we see, sometimes they use Gmail, but a lot of times they're using anonymous email services like Gorilla Mail, SigAint, Telegram, and some of these other ones that are located outside the U.S. They don't maintain records, and they don't respond to legal service from the United States. So that creates a problem. And then they're also using the suicide prevention hotlines, as Kathleen had just mentioned. They're using the VA particularly, where they're calling in and saying, oh, my name's John Smith, and I want to commit suicide, but before I do that, I'm going to go to my local high school and shoot up the school. And then that suicide prevention hotline person is then calling the local police in that jurisdiction, and then that just ramps things up from there. So getting those out there and then trends and how they're doing it is part of that, part of the characteristics, and how hopefully we can help slow these down.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. The overseas actors, the hotlines, I'm with you. You have to treat everyone seriously, but there can be so many. So one of the things that can help slow maybe the prevalence of anonymized threats is good deterrence, right? We think about this with other threats, about what can we do proactively before anyone picks up the phone and makes a threat or emails, to educate folks better, both our staff that are receiving those, but also our community, right? Our students, our teachers, our parents. What are some of the opportunities that would help deter anonymized threats for schools?
I think the number one opportunity is that in 2025, there should not be any school system that does not have a comprehensive emergency plan. And I think the days of writing your emergency plan and looking at it for, I was looking at my school handbook online the other day. I'm a year overdue, right? You can't be a year overdue with your emergency plans. And you have to actually follow them. And I think that is probably the most important thing a school can do first is, and your emergency plans aren't in a vacuum. They're with your local police department. They should be writing them with you. They should be reacting to them, but we can't be propping doors, because it's hot out. We can't be holding the door for the person behind us. And we've all heard this, but I think we assume it's not going to happen in our community, and we get lackadaisical with things like locking doors and cameras, and, oh, the cameras haven't been working for 6 months. If we decided that the emergency plan was important enough to write and to implement and to print, then we need to practice it. It has to be what we do every year, multiple times a year. We no longer just do fire drills. We don't take away from educational practice. We do a drill a month, and they're all different ones, but you have to do them. So I think that, to me, is having a living document that the police department is involved in creating and in practicing is the number one thing. When I hear educators say, oh, I propped my door, or, oh, my school doesn't even have a plan, or we go from zero to lockdown, there's no shelter in place, it infuriates me, because there are so many things we can do to keep kids safe and not to traumatize kids with false threats. And that's one of them. That's probably the biggest.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, when it comes to emergency plans, are obviously very important. I think having a document dealing specifically with anonymized threats, the swatting and hoax emails, phone calls, etc. Some of that is done through training, right? So I offer a training course that is available online. It's virtually, and it's about an hour long, and it goes through identifying those characteristics. I play phone calls. I give you the emails to look at so you can see what it looks like, what it sounds like. Because those call takers, the people that are opening up those emails, need to understand what they look like and what they sound like before. So they can understand and be able to identify, again, those distinct characteristics that are there, that are very evident if you just slow down, take a breath, and really evaluate that threat and look at it holistically across the board. And that's the most important thing to do. And part of that training, I say, there's a difference between a hoax threat, a low-risk threat, and then what we say is a high-risk threat. High-risk threats are from a known individual. They're direct, they're specific. These threats that are hoaxes are non-specific, they don't provide details, and there's nothing that can be verified. So you combine that with some of the other characteristics that are going to be evident in there, and you'll be able to identify them as a hoax immediately. And just, again, going through the drills like that, identifying those, and again, just keeping it in the back of their mind of, The bank robber is not going to call the bank and say, I'm coming to rob your bank today at 9 a.m., right? Well, the active shooter is not going to call the school and say, I'm hiding in the bathroom and I'm with my daddy's shotgun and I'm coming out, right? That is not what they want to do. These individuals have considered, they planned, and they prepared, and they want to follow through with their attack. They're not going to give you a warning. So the first indicator is going to be the warning. So take a breath and say, this doesn't necessarily make sense. Let me, again, having law enforcement involved in that threat assessment process, it's got to be quick, but be able to look at it holistically and say, okay, yes, this has all the hallmarks of being a hoax.
Yeah. So, today we're discussing anonymized threats, but what I'm hearing from you guys is having a plan, practicing your plan, training your staff, continual improvement and continue ongoing. This is pretty true about a lot of safety topics, right? Sure. So while anonymized threats might be newer to us or something maybe we weren't dealing with 10 years ago, it kind of sounds like the basics of our school safety playbook are what this is about, right?
Right. And I think, when I listen to Brian talk about, like, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes there are signs you can see right away. As an educator, I'm not a law enforcement person, right? So it's not why I went into this. Unfortunately, but it's a serious thing that school administrators now, that is part of our job, right? So safety, keeping kids safe, using common sense around safety, enforcing safety protocols, that's all our job. But, there are things that, obvious things in a threat that you can be like, there's no way there's 17 people here. Like, you can get a threat that's saying there are multiple people here on campus. We can determine that in 5 minutes with use of our cameras, whatever. But as educators, and I think where some of the breakdown of this happens is that partnership with the law enforcement. Because I don't care how crazy the threat is, I'm never going to hang up a phone or close my computer and say, no way. It was so obvious, because I don't make that decision. So I think there's a two-prong approach to it. It's what I do immediately. Yeah. And then when my partner law enforcement, which I'm so fortunate in Newtown, maybe for the wrong reasons, we're a well-oiled machine in a lot of ways that I wish everybody could be. They're phenomenal with their response and their balancing of response. But we immediately call law enforcement, because they're the one who technically have to declare this is a hoax or this is a swatting. That is not, I take everything as crazy as it can be at face value and as serious as possible without the overreaction piece that some people experience, but because maybe they haven't had experience with it. But when you actually break it down and debrief, which is a whole nother thing that people don't do, you need to debrief. You need to debrief with your local law enforcement so you change things for next time. When you actually debrief, you do look at some of them and you're like, oh God, it was so obvious right from the beginning. But as an educator, that is not my lane, But unfortunately, it has become part of what we do, because I need to be able to say to the police, there's nobody, it does not appear there's anybody here. Here's all the information regarding the phone call or the email or whatever immediately, so they can balance their response as well. And it's a big responsibility. Like, when you think about it, it's like you don't want to be the person. They don't call ahead, but you don't want to be the first person they do call ahead for, Right.
Yes. And Brian, it sounds, I cited some data at the top, right? We know these anonymized threats are increasing. So it's not a case of if this will happen. It might be more of a case of when these type of things happen. And look, they're stressful when you receive one of these anonymized threats. So talk to me about, all right, a school's received one of these anonymized threats. Maybe it's a call into the main office, a screenshot from social media, concerns expressed through the school's reporting app. What are some of the immediate actions and things that we're thinking through when that threat's received?
Right, from that perspective, as that call taker or the person that's opening up that email, number one, if it's a phone call, try and identify where the phone call is coming from. So look at the caller ID with it. Record it if possible. If you have the means to do that, simply maybe use your cell phone to do that. If it's an email, leave the email open on the screen, take a picture of it. If it's a letter that came in, don't touch it. Put it in a plastic bag, leave it alone, don't touch it like that. You want to get your site decision makers there as soon as possible. So the person answering the email or phone call are obviously going to notify the superintendent or the principal right away. they can start to evaluate that threat there from their own perspective. But then you do want to call law enforcement, and that's an immediate notification to law enforcement. But again, telling them this is what came in, accurately portraying what was said on the phone call, or if it's the email, and read it to them. And again, if the call says there's an active shooter right now at the high school, and there's not an active shooter, as you know, we've talked about that, then you could have a more measured response, right? Simply by doing that. Again, maintaining the chain of custody of it if that's required, and limiting any kind of touching of it if it's a letter. But again, recording of it, getting those characteristics that are going to be evident, like the lack of details, no specifics. Ask questions. Ask your full name, including the middle name, and then follow up a minute later and see if it matches, right? If they claim to be a student, but they don't want to give you their name, well, ask them their favorite teacher's name. What's their homeroom number? There's questions like that you can ask them to catch those inconsistencies, and you can call them out on those inconsistencies. Many times they're using anonymized numbers, but they'll have voice changing technology, so they may have an accent or changing the way their voice sounds, so they sound like a child. And they may have, the accent may be from a different area. They may not pronounce the school name correctly or a street name correctly. So there's certainly things like that, again, you can listen to, that you can pick up on. Listen for the background noise. Is there background noise at all? In some cases, you would expect to hear something. Yeah. In some cases, and a lot of times there's not. Or you hear typing on a keyboard because they're using a text to voice. Or they may have recordings of gunshots and other recordings that you're going to be listening to as well. So there's a lot of characteristics that just by listening, you'll be able to pick up on as well.
And I think that, when we talk about like being administrators or teachers, and how this is now part of our responsibility as, what we do, school secretaries are the ones getting these phone calls. Like, right. Think about that. Like, so you didn't go into the school secretary realm to decide to get swatted. And so what we really promote, again, it goes back to what Brian just said about best protocols for swatting. Your resource, and I said this to you today, and not because I'm here and you asked me to be here, but the K-12 resource that was put out regarding this, anonymous threat is phenomenal. Yeah. And when I was reviewing it this week, I was reading some of these specific questions that you have talked about, what to talk to people about, but you have to practice that with your staff in your office. Yeah. Because what they want to do is they want to hang up, which I don't blame them. But I don't want them to hang up because I want to know if it's real. Yeah. It would be easy not to answer those phone numbers when you know they're not real. But to me, it's an ethical dilemma. Like, what if it really is a threat? I have to answer it, and I have to deal with it. But we do tabletops with our school secretaries. It's the same with bomb threats. They're the ones who get them. Yeah. And we have to make sure that we are educating them as well. So we try to include them with our police department when we do tabletop. Because I know when it says, Dr. Gamos, please report to the office, and there's a certain voice, I know that means there's a crank caller, generally. But I also know that my staff has been trained not to, but when to your point, how stressful it can be when it's over, we all collapse. Yeah. Because you realize, really what the stress that is on your shoulders, and that, and it generally is children. Yeah. It's generally, we get them from out of the country. We haven't had recently lots of them, but when Sandy Hook first happened, we would get them from out of the country a lot. But that's an important piece, is having those questions right. This document, this emergency plan, cannot be under somebody's desk. Right. The secretaries on their desk should have how to handle these phone calls at a minimum. Yeah,
I was in a school here in Virginia last week, and I was so heartened that both next to all the phones receiving calls and on their lanyards, they had some reminder tips for dealing with these types of situations.
That's excellent.
It's like, okay, this is part of it, right?
Yep.
And we're going to be prepared.
And it's so sad, right? And it's so scary, and it's so ridiculous that this is what educators have to worry about. But to your point, it's excellent, because it's either that or this huge response that traumatizes adults and children for absolutely risking lives, right? For police lives, kids' lives. There
have been incidents where children have been could have been shot by officers when they had a negligent discharge. One child was struck by a car and killed after being forced to walk home after a bomb threat was received in his community. So there are tragedies like that that have happened
Yep.
over and over again across the country from where hoaxes and what you can identify as hoax right away if you just slow down a bit and with that.
So what I hear you is, okay, we get the stress when these come in, but gathering information, documenting that, following up, these are all gathering decision makers. These are all the initial steps, right? I feel like maybe this was a little bit ago when the trend was first started. There was this, okay, hit the panic button, lock it down, dismiss the school. But, you know, this seems like the reasonable first step, right? So
our school, I just want to mention our school plans, hopefully, nationally, because the government and local law enforcement has done a lot of work, we don't go from zero to lockdown
Right.
anymore.
And there's other consequences to lockdown or dismissal.
It's true,
right?
like under desks, we don't go under desks. I mean,
Right.
to me, a lockdown is, we're hiding.
Sure.
Right, that's what lockdown is. But there is shelter in place. There's safe school mode. There are so many things you can do before that do not compromise the safety of kids.
And that's where I want to go.
Yeah.
Okay, so we get these threats. We're going through that initial assessment. How do we decide? Do I lock down? Do I go to safe school mode? What do I do? So balancing that risk is critical. And you said earlier, you know, school officials, they're kind of put in this position. So how should schools be thinking about scaling or balancing that as they assess? What do we do with the kids? How do we take care of them and our learning environments?
So I think it comes down to back to the security plans and procedures you have in place. If you have a good, solid security plan dealing with not just the active shooter threats, but bomb threats and swattings, then you can rely on that. And you'll know the physical security measures you have in place in your school are also in place. So when you get that email that says there are bombs in the lockers, or you get the phone call that says there are bombs in the lockers, you can go, okay, let's pull back and let's look at the video cameras for the last 3-4 days. Okay, there's no signs of forced entry, the alarm system never went off, the cameras don't show anybody getting in and hiding any bombs, so we feel secure with that. But if it comes down to it and you say, well, the call said that there were bombs hidden in the lockers, well, then I'd ask you, what locker is it in? Well, we don't know, they didn't say. Well, then why would you ever allow a student to walk by any locker? Because if you really believe that there's a threat, then they're safer inside of their classroom behind the walls made of concrete and rebar, right? So a shelter in place allows you to have time to slow down, evaluate the threat, and establish a safe evacuation route and rally point. Because let's say it's the worst case scenario, somebody wants you to just immediately evacuate to that location so that they can set up there, right? And be able to have their free reign of shooting children, let's say, which has happened in some cases, right? In Jonesboro particularly. So trusting those security measures that are in place, evaluating that threat in that regard of taking a breath and saying, okay, let's really evaluate this, getting law enforcement there as well to be able to evaluate it holistically. And then communication is also key, right? Amongst other principals in your town, in your community, across the state to say, hey, we just got this threat. And they can say, oh, we got the same one.
Yeah.
Now you know, hey, it's a chain that's going around, it's as we call a cluster. You can tone it down a notch, right? And that's the training I give to law enforcement as well. Share information accurately and quickly amongst a variety of agencies across your state and across the region. And then you can get that true situational awareness and then have a much more measured response.
And I think that to that end, sharing information. I mean, I'm in a unfortunate but unique situation that my network, I can text principal of Parkland, principal of Columbine, I can text them in 4 minutes, say anybody else get this phone call. And if they all did, then that, again, I never say it isn't true, but it scales us down. It takes us down a notch till my law enforcement says, it's not real or it is a hoax. But I think to your point, Don, the first thing I do is I gain control. Because while I'm working with, our safety plan and with our local law enforcement while they're on their way, I have to have control of the babies in my school. So anytime there's anything, we come, safe school mode means we're just all in the building. We're all going about our business, depending on what it would be. Shelter in place means I know every adult and every child, I know where they are. It's kind of like a fire drill inside, right? We're all, if I say please go into shelter in place, which I do whenever there's a police response for anything, just because it's just better, and that allows us to be ready to move to the next level if we had to. If there was, imminent threat is really the level for lockdown. And imminent threat means they're here and we know they're here. But shelter in place is probably every school in the country should be practicing it and doing it, and that is just getting control, right? So I know all of the kids are in classrooms, they call the office, I know which kids are missing. I can say, oh, all the kids can go back from the nurse. I determine if there's movement in the hallway. I determine if parents can come or go. But this way I have control. So if God forbid I had to go into a lockdown, we are in such a better, safer place. And I have all the adults paying attention to what I might call next, and so that's a really important piece. And it goes back to these plans that you have to be able to scaffold them for any reason. If we come into, years ago we came into a message on the thing from 12 hours ago. I'm not putting kids in lockdown, but I'm also not calling law enforcement and saying this message was left on the machine, and I'm not sending kids out for recess either until it's determined that we're safe. So I really think that control piece is important, but it's also important so that when the police get there, kids are out of the way, everybody is safe. Teachers are on the lookout, and Brian said something this morning, or maybe last time we talked about it, or maybe I read it in his stuff, that if there was really a threat on campus, teachers are going to let you know. They heard something, they saw something, you know what I mean? It's not like we're 8 buildings,
right?
So.
Yeah, it's pretty rare when there's a threat that you're only hearing about it through one factor, right?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, exactly.
Right.
A lot of people are calling. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Like right now, we're seeing a lot of the calls coming in the police departments on the non-emergency numbers, and it'll be one single call coming in saying, I'm in a school and there's been an active shooter and 6 of my students have been shot and I've been shot at, and it's one single call coming in. And he's completely deadpan, no emotion in his voice. The background, there's no background noise, right?
Yeah.
So that should be the red flags all day of, that sounds like a hoax, right? Because if that was real, you're going to be inundated with 911 calls if that's what it is coming to the police department like that.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. The idea of being able to slow down, gain control of the situation, and sort of be in a ready position to adjust, I mean, those are critical elements. I appreciate you plugging the resource, the Anonymized Threat Response Guidance that was published by CISA and by the FBI this past year, which really, in partnership with the K-12 community, consolidates a lot of what we're talking about today and is a great resource.
And if you don't have emergency plans, it's a perfect place to
Build
start.
to it. That's right.
Because you have them for a bunch of things, but that is the emergency plan for this situation.
So you talked earlier about partnerships, and you just talked about when law enforcement gets there, right? So I could only imagine if we don't have a well-built out system that law enforcement rolls in with one idea, the school's doing something else. I mean, that's got to be pre-practice. So certainly law enforcement's part of this, but what are some of the other community partners that need to be involved in managing these type of threat situations? And what are some of the roles that you think through? What's appropriate roles for those different partners that are involved in responding to anonymized threats at schools?
I'm going to say it wrong, but is it incident command?
Incident command, yeah.
Yeah. So the federal government or the FBI has an incident command protocol, which means I'm incident commander till they get there, and then they're incident commander, and we do it for fire drills. But something as simple as that, if schools were to learn that protocol, it teaches us. But I have a relationship, so that's different, right? So what happens is they become incident commander, but I have to be there because they don't know. I know things they don't know.
Right.
I know where kids are or whatever. I think that partnership, but I think the media, which I haven't really gotten a hold of. I don't want to be negative, but most recently, a year and a half ago, I had a situation where there was a swatting call to the school, and one of our local media put it out on social media, active shooter. And there was nothing even close to it. They had a police scanner, they grabbed a piece of something, and so that media no longer is allowed near my campus. They'll never cover another pumpkin patch as long as they live. But anyway, because that, to me, that's a really big partner that's not okay. Right, so because we need them as well. Like I need them when I need them, but they didn't help that situation at all. So I think media would be another partner. I think local law enforcement.
Absolutely.
Parents, they have to trust you.
Parents, yeah. And I think the key is that the first time you're meeting somebody shouldn't be at a crisis.
Yeah.
Right, during the crisis. It should be before that. So if you don't have that relationship, if you don't have a school resource officer in your school, then I encourage you to go out, meet with the local chief and try to develop that relationship where maybe a part-time school resource officer, or at least get face-to-face, talk through these plans, do the tabletop exercises. Because you should also know this, yes, for the active shooters, for inclement weather, for any number of emergencies that may come up, again, that are outlined in the school resources that you have, and what to do in a swatting incident, right? Because, as you mentioned, the school, maybe they sat through the training, they went through this, they feel comfortable of like, hey, we got this phone call, we don't really think it's real. But then the police department shows up with their SWAT team and they're running through the halls, and it's trying to navigate that. It could be difficult during the crisis, where if you met beforehand, everybody got on the same page of like, these are the things we're looking for. They've had the same level of training that, and vice versa, so that you can, again, have that communication beforehand. And if the call comes to the police department, they should be calling the school to say, hey, we just got this phone call saying there's an active shooter. Is everything okay?
Right.
And as opposed to this, they're just rolling right in with weapons drawn and running through the hallways without actually interfacing beforehand. So it's important to open those lines of communication long before an emergency happens.
Right. I think it's critical to recognize that the strength of our work in so many cases is the strength of our relationships.
100%.
And in this case, in the case of an anonymized threat, right, law enforcement's critical to that. We as school leaders don't have the ability to often suss out who's making the threat, but law enforcement has a set of tools to work that through, right? So it's truly a partnership, and expectation setting is critical. So we talked a little bit earlier about clusters and how sometimes these anonymized threats come in areas. And so to me that says, okay, how are we sharing that information among schools? You know, for when I think about my time in a school building, sort of our internal information sharing was, what are our students and staff telling us through our reporting systems, right? The importance of bystander reporting, and we have resources on that are critical, but also how are schools leaders sharing information with other school leaders? How are law enforcement sharing information if these threats are circulating? So, I'm interested, how should schools think about connecting the dots and information sharing when it comes to these type of situations?
I think it has to go through local law enforcement.
Well, some of it,
right? Because I don't know how one system, one town, I guess the superintendents in an area can all share, right? There are 8 of our superintendents in Connecticut that meet regularly. Right. So they can share then, but law enforcement is normally who says to us, like the Veterans Hotline was a hot one for a while. Yes. I don't know if it still is, but in the fall, that was the hot one. And, my district got a couple of them, and so did this district, that district. Yeah. So that came through law enforcement.
Yeah. So there's a couple ways when I talk to law enforcement particularly, and I train them, a couple ways for them to share information. They can send it for law enforcement on the line today. You have an NCIC admin message that gets blasted out to every NCIC terminal in the state, so every police officer in their car is going to get this to say, this is the email address it came from, the phone number it came from, etc. The other way to do that is through the state or regional fusion center. You contact the fusion centers and they blast that out to every other community in their area of responsibility, but also every other fusion center across the country. They can start to collate that information. And there's also an excellent tool that the FBI created called the Virtual Command Center for Swatting that is available for law enforcement only, and it is a database that they can access that you can search based on the phone number or an email address or the verbiage of the threat to see if it's been used anywhere else in the country. And that's been used to great success around the country. I've got a couple examples that I talk about in my training where it's been used to quickly mitigate it, to say, hey, that phone number that came in is the same one that was used at 10 other swattings across the country. And just that fast, you can tone it down and slow things down like that. And then, again, share that information with the schools to say, hey, we just checked the VCC. this is the information that we found, and we've already, we blasted it out through NCIC or through the Fusion Center, and they confirmed this is the same one that went out 2 days ago.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about how stressful it is when these threats are received. Imagine if you're a school leader, if you received an email an hour earlier from one of your colleagues that said, hey, we just got this, we're investigating, we don't think it's legit.
100%.
But if then you get it, it's like, okay, it immediately takes
Right.
my temperature down,
Yeah,
right?
it takes my temperature down, but it doesn't turn it off.
No, but,
Because I
but we
don't
build
ever-
that into our
right,
plan
yes,
to communicate
yes,
with those around us because we know that one area.
You don't want to make
geographically.
decisions in a vacuum. That's
Right.
what we've seen in so many of these cases.
Yeah.
In 2016, we're hit pretty extensively with robo-threats, where there was a robotic voice calls.
Yep.
And it just wreaked havoc because everybody was making decisions in a vacuum because nobody knew they weren't the only ones getting it. They were targeting hundreds of schools at the exact same time with these robocalls, and they were all going in panic mode.
Yeah.
And so we need to share information.
We talked earlier about slowing down, about gaining control of the situation, about having our partnerships and plans in place. Well, part of that ability is having information. Information is power when it comes to slowing down and gaining control of situations. So in the case of anonymized threats, when, sometimes, right, we talk they come from foreign actors or different things, but I mean, they could be from a student, right, or a member of our community that, could be a call for help, right?
Absolutely.
And so, many schools are having their behavioral threat assessment management team or program involved in these kind of things, which is critically important because once we find out who is making this threat, right, how can we wrap around services about them? So what kind of people might you expect to see be involved from the school and law enforcement side in that threat assessment situation? And what sort of is the key role that BTAM plays in response to these type of threats?
So I can say that most of the time, the BTAM teams aren't getting involved right away because these are so acute, there's such a crisis mode when they're going that fast that you don't have time to convene the whole team. So what you'll have is the individuals, police officers, the superintendents that have been through some training, like the training I offer, they've read through the documentation that CISA provides. And they kind of have that general idea of how to evaluate one of these threats to see if it's an anonymized hoax and be able to identify those characteristics that are in there. If it's leaning like it could be something else where it's a known individual, right? If a known student posts on Snapchat a picture of a gun and says, I'm coming to school tomorrow to settle things up, that is totally different than what we're talking about today, right? That is something that is a high-risk threat that needs to be handled very quickly and appropriately. Best way to do that, yes, is with a multidisciplinary threat assessment team. But being able to triage these and look at them quickly, there's just not a lot of time to have a whole BTAM look at it. Because again, the characteristics are there. Like the VA hotline, things like that, as they come through, you should be able to look at that and go, I got a pretty good sense that this is a hoax. But again, if it's a known student, posted on known social media, if it's leakage, where they're talking about conducting some kind of an attack to a friend, a peer, their school projects that they're turning in have this kind of language in it where there's fascination with prior active shooters and these other really red flags that pop out to you to say this person is in need of help. That is needs to be an intervention right away.
Absolutely. Well, Kathy Brown, I could talk to you all day as moderator, but as moderator, I promised the audience we're going to take some of their questions. So let me start with this, and Kathy, I want to start with you. Some of our audience members want to know, can you talk to us and elaborate a little bit more about what safe school mode means?
Sure. So, so there are 3 levels of response that most districts have now, and safe school mode is the first, and that just means everybody's in the building and campus is closed. So kids would know no different, right? So they're going to gym, they're going to art, they're not out at recess, front doors aren't opening, and that just is the first layer of control. So it's different than shelter in place because that means you're not even moving around the building. If I say, we are now going into a shelter in place, whatever rooms they're in, kids in the bathroom return to their rooms, they stay in their classrooms, they stay in the art room, they stay in the gym without moving. And we can take attendance. But safe school mode really means the school is just closed in on itself. So there are no, campus is closed, parents aren't coming in. We recently, very inexpensively, put gates at the top of all our driveways, so they're manual, so someone can go out and close it, so that we're in safe school mode. Then that would mean, we're just trying to slow down and figure out what, and that could be for a dysregulated kid. Right? That could be for a kid that is running around the building, or a kid that is going outside. I mean, all these things can be used for other things rather than just threats.
Yeah.
But that is just keeping us inside.
Right.
Safe school mode.
Yeah. Another one from the audience here gets to the apathy, right? Unfortunately, all of us in this nation understand in a deep sense can think about all these school tragedies we have. But there seems to be across America, it won't happen here attitude, right? Like, yeah, school shootings are, but not in my town, right? What advice do you have for folks about how to break through that apathy, about the seriousness of what this means?
Go ahead. Because it's happening in towns next to Newtown. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. When you're talking in regards to swatting and hoax threats,
or just
or even real.
So I can say this when it comes to that. So
school safety.
The chances of a school shooting are very slim statistically. They're very slim, very rare. As much as they're on the news and sensationalized, they're actually very rare. But I think statistics show that swatting and hoaxes, you're going to get hit with it. I can guarantee you're going to get one. If you haven't yet, then it's a matter of time. But I can guarantee you're going to get swatted. You're going to get a hoax phone call or email in some nature. So talking through this training, right? Talking through those characteristics, doing a tabletop exercise, working with your local law enforcement is key to having a safer response. Now, when it comes to an active shooter, a real incident like that, I mean, again, I think you just mentioned it. Look at all the incidents that have happened across the country, and every one of those communities said the same thing, right? This isn't happening in the inner city, if you haven't noticed, right? These are happening in the smaller towns, the rural towns, and everybody needs to take that and look at that and get the training and the warning behaviors that the teachers should be looking for, the peers should be looking for, parents, and establishing those multidisciplinary threat assessment teams is essential in those communities across the board, because that's the only way we're going to prevent anything from happening in the future.
And I think, again, with planning and with good plans in place, even apathy around swatting and hoaxing calls. I don't want to ever have apathy around it. I don't want to overreact. I know they come through vets lines now. Yep. But when I get a call from the superintendent saying one of our schools, got a call from a vet line, again, we go through our protocols because we have them.
That's right.
I don't think anybody should take any of these calls and not let local law enforcement know you got it. Even to me, that that is apathy, right? When they're like, "Oh, I know that was a stupid kid, dumb." Yeah. Well, I might know it's a stupid kid too, but at least I forward it to them because for the connections, for the communication, I'm not law enforcement, so I'm not determining whether it's a stupid kid. They need to do that.
Yeah, they should.
And as far as apathy with school shootings, I feel like it's human nature in a lot of ways. Like, I don't know, because every one of our communities has said it would never happen to us.
Right. You study the history of violence in schools in our country, and every town would have said that, right?
100%.
But it's so important for every member of the community to understand the why we do things, right? When we say lock the doors, right? And I visit schools and say lock doors, right? Sure, locking doors is important, but you have to explain to people why, right? Because we are here to ensure a safe learning environment, right? Why we're doing these different things and how everybody has a hand in creating a safety culture. So we talked earlier about tabletop exercises and practicing. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the details about maybe what you guys have seen? Here at CISA, we offer tabletop exercise packages that schools can download. It's all built out for them. They just put in their own information and can do a tabletop exercise. But maybe what are some of the benefits of a tabletop exercise and other resources you're aware in this space?
I would just say, we just did one this year in Newtown about a tanker truck with some kind of poisonous gas in it got into a car accident, right? So, and I was there like, come on, I got better stuff to do. You guys would tell me what to do. But when we went through it after 3 hours, it's amazing, right? Because my thing was, why not just ask the guy what's in the truck? Why do you have all these protocols for what's in the truck, And they're like, well, you can't go near the truck. And so I think for my learning is number one, it gives you a relationship with your local law enforcement.
Right.
It also gives you an opportunity to think safety, right? So we've done them on school shootings, we've done them on active shooter. I mean, you do them on all kinds of stuff, even a tanker down the street with a toxic gas in it gets in an accident. I just don't know how else you would learn how you would react, how other people would react. It's like debriefing something before it happens.
Yeah.
And everything that we've gotten better at in Newtown, it's because we've taken the time to debrief it. Like if we have a big hoaxing thing, we go to the Newtown police that night and a table of 20 people debrief my response, their response, what we did wrong. And there's no personalities, there's no, people in the room that want to pretend they did everything right. We just want to get better. But I don't know how you develop relationships or you pitfalls.
Yeah.
It's how you figure out if you don't have a list of buses.
Exactly.
How you figure out you don't have bus drivers' phone numbers. That's when you do it, when you go through these practices.
That's right.
Yeah, it gives you a chance to exercise your plan before it's a crisis. That's right. And it's free. Doesn't cost any money. Yep. You can do it in 20 to 30 minutes, realistically. Yep. And your plan is only as good as the people that know your plan. Right. And so get everybody involved. So if the principal's not in, then the assistant principal needs to know what the plan is. It can't just be in somebody's head. It's got to be there on paper. To have all those contingencies in there, make those face-to-face connections before the incident happens. So then you understand why the police are doing what they're doing, then they understand what you're doing as well. And so you can work through those contingencies together. And again, the big thing is there's no cost, right? To do a big full-scale exercise takes money, it takes time. Teachers have to be out of school, or you got to do it on the weekend, and et cetera. And so tabletop, 20, 30 minutes, during lunch even, you can do it that fast and make those connections and exercise.
And school administrators could do them alone too.
Right.
Like you could pull your leadership team and 3 teachers and say, if this occurred in the school, how would we react?
Right. I think that's so important, right? People think they're these massive time
No, they're
energy.
not.
You can do them a lot of ways. I know of schools that start their Monday staff meetings with a scenario question. We're going to spend 10 minutes on it.
It doesn't have to be formal.
It doesn't have to be a whole thing,
Exactly.
right? And that's so important. It's when people ask me about this, a school safety plan is so important, but just like as educators, we wouldn't just give kids the book to read and say, learn it. We have experiential learning, right? We work through things. This is how we learn and institutionalize, because under that fight or flight of a scenario, of a crisis situation, you need to be able to rely on your learning. It's so important. So I think we have time for one more here. So studies have shown that shooters often do tell people about their plan. Brian, you mentioned the phrase leakage earlier. When someone mentions such a plan, how do you determine whether the threat is genuine or not? What's that piece?
That is a great question, and that is the ultimate dilemma when it comes to behavioral threat assessment, is evaluating those statements that have been made with that leakage. Is that leakage? Is it a kid that's just simply dysregulated, that just makes a hyperbolic statement, right? Or is it something more than that? And the important thing is looking holistically at that individual, the person of concern, of what is their background, do they have prior violent incidents? What are they looking at in their social media? Are there other individuals that you can talk to and do a good 360 review of that individual and their associates, their peers, their teachers, to say, what did their school project look like? What does the internet traffic look like? Their social media? Is there leakage to other individuals? So there's so many key components. Again, you have to look at it holistically and not just rely on that one simple statement that's a snapshot in time. Behavioral threat assessment requires a longer term review of all of that material to really make a good, solid assessment and looking at all those factors and looking for those other warning behaviors. Is there pathway behaviors, or is there identification behavior, or fixation kind of behavior? And these are all things, again, that behavioral threat assessment teams are trained on to look for in those types of behaviors. But that's what you're looking for, is specific behaviors that are going to be evident of what they're thinking and what their intent is.
And I think the important piece to behavioral threat assessment teams is they're varied, right? So if I'm a teacher who has a relationship with a kid, or I'm a mom, I am not the only eyes that should be doing this behavioral threat assessment, because I think there's bias, right? As a principal, I don't want to believe that baby, that I know this kid, I know his mom, I know his family. I don't want to call and say, I really So I think, and I don't think anybody is ever brushing things under the rug. I don't think that's the case. I think what happens is our biases come in, our emotionality comes in, our relationships with people come in. So it's really important. That's why, your team includes local law enforcement. Your team includes mental health personnel, not necessarily only the social worker that works with the kid every week, because again, that's a personal thing. You bring in a different counselor to look at. Like, it has to be looked at comprehensively, because in the end, we want to get kids the proper help they need. And saying, oh, he's a good kid, I know he didn't really mean it. Okay, as a mom or as a principal with a relationship, I might believe that, but Brian might come in with new eyes and say, wait a minute. Wait, you're not seeing this the way I see it. You're not seeing this the way I see it. And again, to me, at that point, when we're determining whether it's genuine or not, the fact that we're even determining it says a kid needs services to me.
And that's exactly right.
Whether they mean it or not, they need something.
Whatever the situation, and that potential leakage is a sign that young person
Needs
is going
something,
to need a lot of
100%.
intervention and support potentially.
Absolutely.
So as we begin to wrap up today, you are going to receive an email following today's training with a set of resources that are available. Brian, you heard today about the training offered from Brian and the FBI. Here at CISA, the resources that we have from our Office of Bombing Prevention, our Office for Security Program, as well as our school safety team. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention schoolsafety.gov, which is the repository of more than 700 resources across a range of topics that make up comprehensive school safety, from the Departments of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, and us here at the Department of Homeland Security. These are all tools that you can have in your hands, that you do have in your hands, to access to improve the safety and security of your school communities. In your Q&A chat on the side of your screen, you're going to see a link to an end of training poll. I encourage you to take that, particularly if you're seeking a participation certificate for today's session. Please remember to complete the poll at the start of the session and this one here at the end of today's session. Brian and Kathy, I could go on for hours with you, but this is where I'd like to kind of close things out today. The topic of school safety, these emerging threats, it's so complex, right? But can you maybe share with us some of the successes and breakthroughs we've had in this area this past year? What are some of the reasons to be optimistic and hopeful? What are you seeing that inspires you in the area of school safety?
Well, I think some of it, and twofold, right, is the establishment of those multidisciplinary behavioral threat assessment teams. You're seeing greater buy-in from the school community with that, and taking advantage of the trainings that are out there and the resources to help establish those teams, and being able to really, truly evaluate every child that is going through crisis. And then when it comes to the anonymized threats, I think the training that's out there and the resources that are available is really educating individuals, so that we're seeing a much more measured response than what we used to see, which is the ultimate goal, right? We're not saying hang up the phone, delete the email, don't do anything, but we're seeing less of the craziness and more of a measured response. That's ultimately what we want to see, and I think we're seeing more of that because of the training, the resources that are out there, and getting that word out that this is what's happening. And you can't let them continue to dictate how you're responding. You need to take control back, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And I would say things like this. I think the fact that we're trying not to educate kids in vacuums anymore, alone in communities. And I think I want to be optimistic and believe that through threat assessment and through see something, say something, that kids are getting help they need. Like, certainly they're not all getting the help they need, but I am ultimately optimistic that we're trying to get more and more kids the help they need, because, I worry about those kids. I worry about the kids we missed that create acts of violence. So I think conversations like this, and I do believe that we're not doing this alone. Like, I think we're all doing it together. Yeah. So I think that matters.
Yeah. Well, Kathy, Brian, thank you.
Thank you.
You both are inspirational leaders in this space, and I'm so lucky to spend this hour with you. On behalf of the team here at CISA, thank you to the FBI and the Principals Recovery Network for joining. And to our attendees today, thank you for taking the time out of your school day to join. Hopefully, today's conversation is the start of something, and we'd encourage you to continue accessing the resources, tools, and reach out to us. We are here to support you and your school communities. Thank you.